In this lecture, we'll be considering some philosophical themes. In this unit, one of the questions we'll consider is, are we precipitating the next mass extinction? This is a very interesting question, but it's not a question I personally am an expert in. However, I can help us all unpack a different question. Ought we precipitate the next mass extinction? Now, you might think there's a very straightforward answer to that question, but what I'd like to invite you to consider is some of the complexities of that question. Of course, the central word in that question is ought. Ought is a normative term, and there's a lot hiding underneath the notion of normativity or prescription, telling you, yourself, or others what should be done or what should not be done. So that's the sort of focus of what I will be encouraging us all to think about. I'm a philosopher, and you might be thinking, well, why is a philosopher involved in this subject? Well, philosophers do a number of things, and some of the things that philosophers do that will be central to this unit are considering the structure of arguments, considering the role of values in arguments, and considering the nature of value itself. We all have values. Some values we hold very dear, but we don't always reflect upon the nature of those values or the source of those values. And that's what I'm going to be encouraging you to do in my role in this unit. So let's spend a little time thinking about argument structure. Arguments are not heated discussions in the pub, or at least that's not what we'll be focusing on. Arguments are relationships that exist between claims that you might make. And those claims are split up into two sorts of claim. Premises, and there may be several premises, and those premises are claims that you might already have good reason to assert. But the idea of an argument is that then the argument allows you to assert further claims, and those further claims are conclusions. So the general idea of an argument is that you arrange claims that you might be willing to make in a certain way, such that you can then make further claims. That's the idea of argument structure. And often if the premises are true and the argument has a good structure, then you have good reason to believe that the conclusion is true. A very famous argument structure is a very simple argument structure. It's as follows. A, if A, then B. Those are the two premises of the argument. And notice that if those two premises are true, then you're able to conclude B. This is a valid structure. And if premises are true and the structure is valid, then the conclusion is true. A valid structure with true premises makes a sound argument. Let's have a look at an example. The grass outside my window is wet, therefore it's rained. Is this argument any good? Well, at the moment, it doesn't seem reasonable to go directly from the premise to the conclusion. There's something missing. It turns out there's a missing premise. Let's now look at this argument. The grass outside my window is wet. If the grass outside my window is wet, then it has rained. Therefore, it has rained. So this is the argument structure we met before. A, if A, then B, therefore B. So it seems like the structure of the argument is good. In the jargon, that means it's a valid argument. But you might still have some doubts, because a valid argument with false premises is still a valid argument, but it doesn't lead to a true conclusion. It's not a sound argument. And it may well be that one of the premises is doubtful. Consider the second premise. If the grass outside my window is wet, then it's rained. In and of itself, that premise may not be true. Consider, for example, if someone had just watered the garden. If someone had watered the garden, then the grass outside my window may well have been wet, but it hasn't rained. So the truth of the premise has been called into question. Argument structure is still valid, but if a valid argument has a false premise, then it's not a sound argument, and you can't necessarily believe the truth of the conclusion. So even if an argument is valid, if a premise is false, then we are not rationally permitted to believe the conclusion. Let's consider a different argument in the context of this unit. Particular human activity is precipitating the next mass extinction. Therefore, humans ought not to do that particular activity. You may happen to believe both of these claims. But is that enough to convince other people? Imagine there's someone out there who believes that particular human activity is precipitating the next mass extinction. Must they then believe that humans ought not do that particular activity? Well, not necessarily, because there's some missing work that needs to be done. Notice that the premise includes the word is, but the conclusion includes the word ought. Those are radically different types of word, and we will discuss this further later in a different lecture, but this is referred to as the is-ought gap. And as it turns out, there's a lot of work to be done between is and ought in order to make sense of such an argument. And it's values that are at work. And we'll be spending some time looking at the nature of values. Value is a very, very complex word. It hides many different types of idea. The values at play may be subjective preferences. And if that's the case, then you may not feel obliged to agree if it's just someone's subjective preference. Alternatively, if the values being talked about are objective truths in some sense, you may be more motivated to take them seriously. So we'll be spending some time thinking about the difference between subjective preferences and objective truths. And the other thing to think about is values can be understood in terms of instrumental values, values that are valuable only because they get you something else, versus intrinsic values, values that might be valuable in and of themselves. So even though it's a very simple word, value, it can be doing work in many different ways. And that's what we will be spending a lot of time thinking about in my role in this unit. So throughout this unit, I encourage you to keep in mind the structure of arguments that you might come across, the role of values in those arguments, and the nature of value.